May 8, 1945, 11:47 a.m. Central European Time. The four-bunker lay silent beneath Berlin's shattered avenues. Hitler's body reduced to ash in a shallow crater above. Church bells echoed across ravaged cities from the Elbe to the English Channel, ringing out the end of the European war. In muddy assembly areas, stretching from Bavaria to the Baltic coast, American tank crews sat atop their M4 Shermans, engines idling, tracks caked in the dirt of 100 battles. The smell of cordite and burnt oil hung in the spring air. They had clawed their way across France, Belgium, and Germany through the Bocage hedgerows, over the Rhine, into the heart of the Reich itself, and now, for the first time in months, the radios crackled, not with fire missions, but with stand-down orders. US 3rd Army After Action Report. May 1945. The men exhaled. Some wept. Others stared silently at the horizon, too numb to celebrate. They had survived Normandy's killing fields, the Ardennes winter, the final desperate counterstrokes of a collapsing empire. Their Sherman's 30 tons of welded steel, riveted armor, and gasoline-fed fury had become their homes, their fortresses, their iron brothers. Every dent in the hull told a story. Every scorch mark mapped a near. These machines had carried them through the inferno. And now, as Europe fell quiet, the question no one had thought to ask began to whisper through the ranks. What happens to us now? The war in the Pacific still raged. Japan had not surrendered. Across the globe, from Okinawa's blood-soaked coral to the jungles of Burma, Allied forces ground forward against an enemy that showed no sign of capitulation. The plan, already drawn up in the war rooms of the Pentagon, was brutally simple. Transfer the victorious mechanized divisions from Europe, refit them, and hurl them against the Japanese home islands in an invasion that would dwarf D-Day. Operation Downfall. Projected casualties: 1 million Allied troops. The Shermans, it seemed, would sail east, their barrels pointed toward Tokyo. U.S. War Department planning memo, April 1945. But on August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m. local time, the B-29 superfortress Enola Gay released a single bomb over Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki vanished in a second flash. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over Japanese radio, an almost divine utterance never before heard by his subjects, announcing surrender. The war ended not with a final tank charge, but with physics, fire, and fallout. The invasion fleets turned back. The Shermans, already crated and loaded onto transport ships in Belgian and French ports, sat motionless in their steel bellies. Destination suddenly uncertain. U.S. Navy Transport Command log. August 1945. 50,000 M4 Shermans had rolled off American assembly lines between 1942 and 1945, more than any other tank in history. They had been produced in 11 major plants: Chrysler's Detroit Tank Arsenal, Fisher Body in Grand Blanc, Ford in Dearborn, Lima Locomotive in Ohio, Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington, Federal Machine and Welder, Baldwin Locomotive, Pressed Steel Car, American Locomotive, Pullman Standard, and Montreal Locomotive Works in Canada. Engineers like William M. Chase and his teams at the Ordnance Department had refined the design through 7 major variants: the original M4, the M4A1 with its rounded cast hull, the welded M4A2 powered by twin GM diesels, the M4A3 with Ford's GAA V8, the M4A4 stretched to accommodate the Chrysler multibank engine, the M4A6 with radial diesel, and the late-war M4A3E8 Easy 8 with wider tracks and horizontal valued suspension. U.S. Ordnance Technical Manual TM9731B, 1944. They had fought on every front: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, the Philippines, Iwo Jima. They had been shipped, landed, repaired, upgraded, knocked out, salvaged, and thrown back into battle. They were, by any measure, the workhorse of Allied mechanized victory, and now they sat idle in the summer and autumn of 1945. As the world's armies demobilized at breakneck speed, the question of what to do with this vast surplus of armor became a logistical and political enigma. Millions of men wanted to go home. Factories that had churned out tanks 24 hours a day pivoted back to automobiles, refrigerators, tractors. The American public, exhausted by 4 years of rationing and sacrifice, demanded a return to normalcy. The military budget, swollen to $83 billion in 1945, faced inevitable, dramatic cuts. There was no appetite for maintaining a massive standing armored force. Yet the Shermans remained, thousands upon thousands of them scattered across 2 hemispheres, each one a 30-ton steel monument to industrial might and battlefield sacrifice. U.S. Bureau of the Budget. Fiscal Report 1946. Some were scrapped immediately. In Europe, salvage crews moved through depots, cutting hulls apart with torches, melting down the steel for reconstruction. It was easier, in many cases, than shipping them home. The cost of transport across the Atlantic often exceeded the value of a used tank. In the Pacific theater, Shermans were bulldozed into the sea or left to rust on jungle beaches, swallowed slowly by vines and salt water. Photographs from the era show eerie tank graveyards, rows of silent Shermans, turrets frozen, tracks half buried in sand, like the tombs of some mechanized civilization. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers survey. Philippines 1946. But thousands more survived. They were mothballed, stored in depots across the American Midwest and South. Fort Knox, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Red River Army Depot, coated in protective grease, sealed and catalogued. They awaited a future that no one could yet predict. The world had changed. The atomic bomb had rewritten the rules of warfare. The alliance with the Soviet Union, forged in the crucible of total war, began to fracture almost immediately. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in March 1946 marked the start of a new kind of conflict, one where tanks, it seemed, might be relics of a bygone age. Yet history, as it so often does, had other plans. In distant capitals, Tel Aviv, Havana, Saigon, new tensions simmered. Borders drawn hastily and the war's aftermath began to crack. Old empires collapsed. New nations rose from the rubble, armed and angry. And in the depots, beneath their canvas shrouds, the Shermans waited. Their story was far from over. In fact, it had barely begun, because what no one understood in 1945 was that the Sherman tank would fight in more wars, for more nations, across more continents, than any armored vehicle in history, and the longest, strangest journey of America's iron workhorse was about to begin. November 29, 1947, to 14 a.m. local time. The Gush Etzion settlement block, 20 kilometers south of Jerusalem. In the darkness, the rumble of engines echoed through the Judean hills, not British Matildas or Arab armored cars, but something heavier, more familiar to those who had fought in Europe. 3 M4A to Sherman tanks, purchased through a labyrinth of front companies and smuggled aboard cargo ships from Italian ports, crawled up the rocky terrain toward besieged Jewish positions. Their hulls bore no markings. Their crews, many of them veterans of the British Army's Jewish Brigade, had painted over every identifier, every serial number, every trace of their American origin. The guns swung toward Arab Legion positions at first light, and when they fired, the 75mm high-explosive rounds announced a new reality. The surplus weapons of World War II had found a second life, and the Sherman had become the most sought-after prize in the emerging global arms market. Haganah Operations Log. November 1947. Declassified 1978. The geopolitical landscape of the late 1940s created perfect conditions for the Sherman's resurrection. America and Britain faced a dilemma. Millions of tons of military equipment sat in depots, costly to maintain and politically awkward to destroy, yet dangerous to distribute in a world fracturing along ideological lines. The Soviet Union had retained its massive tank fleet T-34s, IS-2 South, entire armored armies positioned from East Germany to the Manchurian border. Meanwhile, American defense planners fixated on nuclear strategy, viewing conventional armor as secondary. The result was a fire sale. Through the Military Defense Assistance Program, MD, established in 1949, and earlier ad hoc arrangements, the United States began transferring Shermans to Allied nations at a fraction of their production costs, sometimes for free, other times for as little as $3,500 per tank, a 95% discount from the original $50,000 unit price. U.S. Foreign Military Sales Report, 1949 to 1952. The buyers lined up. France, desperate to reassert control over Indochina and maintain its great power status, acquired hundreds of Shermans between 1947 and 1950. French crews repainted them in colonial, camouflage jungle greens and browns and shipped them to Saigon, where they rumbled through rice paddies and rubber plantations, hunting Viet Minh guerrillas in a war that would consume the nation for nearly a decade. The M4's reliability proved invaluable in the tropical heat. Unlike more complex designs, its components could be field-stripped and repaired by mechanics with basic tools. French Foreign Legion armored regiments adapted the tanks for counterinsurgency, removing bow machine guns to reduce weight, welding extra stowage racks for supplies, mounting .50 caliber machine guns on commanders' cupolas for anti-ambush sweeps. French Colonial Forces Technical Bulletin, Indochina Command, 1951. Italy took 410 Shermans to rebuild its shattered army. The Netherlands received 296 to defend against Soviet incursion and reinforce its colonial holdings in Indonesia. Belgium acquired 423. Denmark, Norway, Portugal, nations that had contributed nothing to the Sherman's wartime production, suddenly fielded entire armored battalions equipped with the American workhorse. But the most dramatic transformations occurred in three unexpected theaters: Korea, the Middle East, and Latin America, where the Sherman would prove that obsolescence is a relative concept and that in the right hands, even yesterday's technology can reshape tomorrow's borders. NATO equipment transfer records. 1949 a 1953. On June 25, 1950, 4:40 a.m. Korea Standard Time, the 38th parallel, North Korean T-3485 tank Soviet with 85mm guns capable of penetrating 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters, smashed through Republic of Korea defensive positions, spearheading an invasion that caught American intelligence completely off guard. South Korean forces possessed no armor, no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping the T-34s. In the opening weeks, North Korean tank columns rolled southward, almost unopposed, crushing defensive lines, terrorizing infantry, threatening to overrun the entire peninsula before American reinforcements could arrive. Then, on July 17, 1950, near the village of Taijon, the tide began to shift. The first M4A3E8 Shermans of the US 8072 and medium tank battalion offloaded at Pusan. Crews scrambling to prepare for immediate deployment. US 8th Army War Diary, July 1950. The Easy 8 variants, the final, most refined version of the Sherman, carried a 76mm high-velocity gun with HVAP high-velocity, armor-piercing ammunition capable of penetrating 150mm of armor at 500 meters. Its horizontal volute suspension system, HVSS, developed by engineer Edward Donnelly and his team at Rock Island Arsenal, gave it superior cross-country mobility compared to the T-34's Christie suspension. At 35 tons combat-loaded, it was 5 tons heavier than earlier Shermans, but could still reach 26 miles per hour on roads. Most crucially, American crews had something the North Koreans lacked: experience, training, and combined arms doctrine honed through years of mechanized warfare. Rock Island Arsenal Technical Report. HVSS Development, 1944, August 8, 1950. The Nakdong River Perimeter. In the brutal heat of the Korean summer, M4A3E8S of Company A, 89th Tank Battalion, engaged North Korean T-3485s at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters, far closer than anyone wanted. Close enough that misses meant death. Sergeant First Class Ernest Comer's tank took up a hold-down position behind a rice paddy berm at dawn. Through the dust and heat shimmer, 9 T-34s appeared, advancing in line formation toward American infantry positions. Comer's gunner, Corporal Harold Kaufman, acquired the lead tank, identified, fire. The 76mm gun roared. The HFAP round struck the T-34's glacis plate at an oblique angle, penetrated, and detonated the ammunition. The tank erupted in a fountain of flame and smoke. Comer's tank shifted position, fired again. Another kill. The remaining T-34s scattered, attempting to flank, but coordinated artillery and infantry anti-tank teams closed the trap. By noon, 6 T-34s lay burning. American losses: 0 tanks, 3 infantrymen wounded. Comer would receive the Medal of Honor, U.S. Army Medal of Honor citation. Ernest R. Comer, August 1950. 89th Tank Battalion After Action Report, August 1950. The Sherman's success in Korea surprised even American commanders. On paper, the T-34 85ths was superior, better armor, comparable firepower, lower profile, but battles are not won on paper. American tanks operated with infantry support, artillery coordination, air superiority, and supply lines that delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts without interruption. Soviet-trained North Korean crews, by contrast, often charged forward in rigid formations, lacking tactical flexibility. By October 1950, when UN forces pushed north toward the Yalu River, Sherman battalions had destroyed or captured over 200 enemy tanks, while losing fewer than 30 of their own kill ratio that validated not just the machine, but the system behind it. US 8th Army Intelligence Summary, October 1950. Yet Korea was only one front in the Sherman's second act. 7,000 miles west, in the deserts and cities of the Middle East, the tank was about to write its most improbable chapter, yet one that would see American-designed armor fighting on all sides of a conflict that continues to this day. May 15, 1948, the day after Israel declared independence, Egyptian M4A to Shermans purchased from British surplus stocks rolled across the Sinai border toward Tel Aviv. Syrian Renault A-35s and Hotchkiss H-39s, relics of France's 1940 defeat, advanced from the Golan Heights. Jordan's Arab Legion, equipped with British armor, moved on Jerusalem, and opposing them, cobbled together from scrapyards and smuggling operations, stood perhaps 24 functional Israeli Shermans, some with broken turret drives, others missing gun sights, nearly all requiring parts that didn't exist in the fledgling nation. Mechanics worked around the clock in makeshift workshops, cannibalizing 3 broken tanks to make 1 combat. They welded spare tracks as additional armor. They fabricated ammunition racks from sheet metal. They painted Hebrew letters on the hulls and drove machines, held together by ingenuity and desperation, into battles that would determine whether their nation survived its first month. Israeli Defense Forces Archive, War of Independence Tank Inventory, May 1948. Declassified 1998. The 1948 war ended in armistice, but the arms race accelerated. Egypt turned to Britain, then increasingly to the Soviet Union, acquiring T-34-85s and eventually T-54s. Syria received Soviet armor through Czechoslovakia. Israel, meanwhile, pursued Shermans with the focus of a nation whose survival depended on qualitative military edge. Between 1948 and 1967, Israeli Ordnance Corps engineers transformed the Sherman from an obsolete World War II relic into perhaps the most modernized tank in service anywhere. They ripped out the original 75mm and 76mm guns, replacing them with French 75mm CN 75-50 high-velocity cannons, taken from AMX-13 light tanks, dramatically increasing penetration performance. Later variants received French 105mm C and 105 F1 guns, the same weapon mounted on the AMX-30 main battle tank capable of defeating 150mm of armor at 2,000 meters. They installed new diesel engines. First, British Cummins VT8 460s, then American Continental AVDS 1790 power plants, producing 750 horsepower, nearly double the original output. They upgraded transmission systems, fire control, and suspension. Israeli Ordnance Corps technical documentation, M50 and M51 Super Sherman programs, 1954 to 1964. The result was the M51 Super Sherman, or Isherman, tank that retained the Sherman's basic hull and turret but shared almost nothing with the 1942 design internally. At 40 tons with the 105mm gun installed, it was heavier, slower, but vastly more lethal than its ancestor. Israeli crews trained relentlessly in desert warfare tactics, shoot-and-scoot maneuvers, hull-down ambushes, combined operations with infantry and air support. The doctrine emphasized speed, precision, and initiative, compensating for numerical inferiority with superior training and technology. And on June 5, 1967, at 7:45 a.m., across multiple fronts, that doctrine was tested in the most decisive armored campaign since World War II. Israeli Defense Forces General Staff, 6-Day War Operations Order, June 1967. The 6-Day War saw Super Shermans engage Soviet-built T-54s, T-55s, and older T-34-85s in the Sinai, Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Golan Heights. In the Sinai alone, Israeli armored brigades including battalions of M51s destroyed over 800 Egyptian tanks, while losing approximately 100 of their own. The 105mm gun proved capable of penetrating T-54 55th's frontal armor at combat ranges when firing heat, high-explosive anti-tank rounds. Egyptian crews, trained in Soviet doctrine emphasizing mass over maneuver, found themselves outflanked, outranged, and overwhelmed. At the Battle of Abu Ajila on June 5–6, Israeli combined arms, tactics paratroopers, artillery, armor, and airstrikes coordinated in a complex night assault, shattered fortified Egyptian positions thought impregnable. Super Shermans breached minefields and engaged dug-in tanks at close range, exploiting confusion and maintaining relentless pressure until organized resistance collapsed. U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. Post-action analysis, Arab-Israeli War 1967, but the Sherman's global odyssey extended far beyond the Middle East. In Latin America, the tank became a symbol of Cold War proxy alignments and regional power projection. Chile received 60 M4A3s between 1948 and 1952, using them to assert territorial claims in border disputes with Argentina and Peru. Argentina acquired 300 Shermans, one of the largest transfers outside Europe, modernizing them in state arsenals and deploying them to suppress internal dissent and project military strength. Brazil took 373 Shermans, creating armored battalions that would remain in service until the 1990s, long after most nations had retired the design. Cuba, under Batista, received U.S. Shermans. After Castro's revolution, those same tanks defended the Bay of Pigs beaches against CIA-backed exiles in April 1961, firing on landing craft in a surreal confrontation where American machines killed men trained by American advisors. U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Bay of Pigs Post-Mortem Report, June 1961, in Asia. The Sherman fought through the 1950s and beyond. French Shermans battled Viet Minh forces at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, though their presence in the valley proved futile against artillery bombardment and human wave assaults. Pakistani forces used M4A1E for Shermans engined with Continental diesels during the 1965 Indo-Pakistani War, engaging Indian Centurions and Soviet-supplied T-54s in the plains of Punjab. Indian forces, also equipped with Shermans alongside Centurions, employed them in infantry support roles where their reliability outweighed their obsolescence. In the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, Pakistani Shermans fought Indian armor in battles around Jessa and Kuna, finally rendered obsolete, not by age but by the appearance of T-55s and Vijayanta tanks mounting 105mm guns. Pakistan Army, Armored Corps Historical Archive, 1965 to 1971 Wars. The psychological impact of the Sherman's longevity is difficult to overstate. For American veterans who had fought in Europe and the Pacific, seeing their tanks in grainy newsreel footage from Korea, Israel, or Indochina produced complex emotions: pride in American engineering, unease at weapons intended for liberation being used in colonial wars or regional conflicts, wonder that machines they had abandoned in 1945 remained relevant 2 decades later. Soviet military analysts studied the Sherman's adaptability with grudging respect, noting in classified assessments that Western armor, properly upgraded and maintained, could remain effective far longer than rigid replacement cycles suggested. The lesson influenced Soviet tank design philosophy: build for longevity, simplicity, and field modification. Soviet General Staff Intelligence Directorate, Assessment of Western Armor Modernization Programs, 1965, translated CIA document. By the 1970s, most Shermans had finally been retired from frontline service, replaced by M60 Pattons, Centurions, T-62s, and the new generation of main battle tanks, but retirement did not mean extinction. Hundreds were converted into armored personnel carriers, bulldozers, artillery tractors, and recovery vehicles roles, where the robust chassis and reliable powertrain continued to serve. Israel's Makmat 160mm self-propelled mortar, built on Sherman hulls, remained in service into the 1980s. Chilean Shermans participated in parades until 1989. Paraguay operated Shermans until 2018-73, years after VE Day, making it the last nation to field the tank. Operationally, Jane's Armor and Artillery, 2018 to 2019. The final accounting is staggering. The Sherman tank fought in at least 47 wars and armed conflicts across 6 continents between 1942 and 2018. It served in the militaries of over 50 nations. It engaged enemy armor in climates ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical jungle to desert sand. It was upgraded, rebuilt, modified, and adapted more extensively than any armored vehicle in history. Engineers in Israel, France, Chile, India, and Italy designed improvements that extended its service life by decades. Crews from Brooklyn, Tel Aviv, Buenos Aires, Saigon, and Seoul learned to drive, maintain, and fight in the same basic machine, each adding their own chapters to its story. International Institute for Strategic Studies, Military Balance, Historical Archive, 1948 to 2018. In the end, the Sherman's legacy transcends steel and firepower. It demonstrated that obsolescence is contextual, that a well-designed system can adapt to changing threats, and that the relationship between technology and doctrine determines battlefield outcomes more than raw specifications. It proved that industrial capacity, the ability to produce, distribute, maintain, and upgrade equipment at scale matters as much as the equipment itself, and it showed that weapons, once unleashed into the world, follow trajectories their designers never imagined, serving causes both noble and brutal, shaping conflicts in places that didn't exist when the blueprints were drawn. The last known operational Sherman sits today in a museum in Paraguay, its engine silent, its gun cold. Children climb on its hull. Tourists photograph its faded markings. Veterans who once commanded such machines are now in their 90s, their numbers dwindling. But in the archives, the after-action reports remain, tens of thousands of pages, documenting where the Sherman went after World War II. The answer, it turns out, was everywhere, carrying with it the ambitions, fears, and contradictions of the post-war world, a 30-ton messenger of American power and the unintended consequences of victory. In the history of armored warfare, no other tank traveled so far, fought so long, or meant so many different things to so many different nations. The Sherman went to war in 1942, expecting to serve for years. It served 76, and in doing so, became not just a